should get rolling. Feel free to mosey on in. Do you mind if I vent about driving for a second? One of the things I've realized over the course of my driving lifetime is that since I learned to drive in the country, the rules of driving are different than the rules, I guess, for people who learn in the city. Like, one of the things, and maybe some of you have this mutual experience, is that all of the roads that I was turning onto growing up in middle of nowhere, Michigan, were 55 miles an hour, right? There's no such, unless I was in the city, Alpena, Michigan, the city, right? Every road I was turning onto was a highway. So one of the rules of turning onto the highway is when judging, right, the distance of a car approaching, you have to keep in mind that they're going at least 55 miles an hour. At least. And so the polite thing to do is to do the internal math of, if I pull out now, are they going to have to slow down to accommodate me? And the decision tree goes like this. If yes, then no, right? You wait until it goes by. It's a country road. Chances are it's the one car that you're going to see for 15 minutes.
And nobody was in a hurry to get anywhere.
Exactly. However, if you're on a road that's extremely busy for some reason, and you realize that you're going to have to make that decision to pull out, you gun it to do as much as possible to inconvenience the other drivers as little as possible. I have realized this rule is not shared in city driving. For example, this morning, I was coming down Taylor's Ferry, and if you know that road, right after you turn off to Willard at Dennis and Jackie, I'm sure you guys probably know, there's I think it's the extension of Palatine Hill Road. Is kind of it's more of a merge with a stop sign than it is necessarily an intersection. And I turned onto Terwilliger because I come out onto Taylor's Ferry. And it was one of those moments where I saw this car pull up to the stop sign. I was already at full speed, which is 35 miles an hour on that road. And I was doing 35. It wasn't speeding yet. And and I saw the car pull up, and I had done the math in my head. I'm like, no, you're too close. There's nobody behind me. You're too close. I'm going to have to slow down to let you in, right? And so in my head, I'm saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And of course, what does it do? Pull out in front. Okay, that's fine. I withheld judgment, I reserved judgment to see if they would do the right thing, which is to speed up, right? To make sure that I didn't have to slow down. And then, no, of course they did. In fact, they equilibrated at a 30 mile per hour speed, 5 miles below the posted speed limit, which I now have decisions. And this is where my wife and I differ, right? Ellen might internally swear, but she is always errs on the side of caution and will automatically, as soon as she sees a car, it could be 5 miles away, as soon as she sees a car, she gets ready to tap the brakes, right? Whereas in my head, I'm doing the following. I'm saying, I'm pretty confident I can stop if I need to, but I'm not going to slow down yet. I'm going to continue at the speed that I was moving at, just to communicate to the driver in front of me that perhaps they should speed up to the speed that I was moving at, if only to be polite, right? They shouldn't inconvenience me. And so what that ends up resulting in is I end up getting closer to their bumper than they're probably comfortable with when I then have to hit the brakes, right? And I'm sure they're looking up now in the rearview mirror going, look at this jerk tailgating me, right? But I just want to remind them about the laws of physics, right? An object in motion stays in motion unless it is impeded by an opposite and opposing force, right? Right? And now I have to make a decision of whether I use their bumper or my brakes to impede my motion. It's costing me money. It's taking away from my brake pad when, okay, if you've heard that. So,
I have to deal with guys like you all the time.
I know. I have to be careful. But it's funny because I'm totally a hypocrite. So, for example, if I get the sense that somebody is going faster than the posted speed limit, especially when it's like like when I'm turning onto Lake Road here right next to Rao, which during school day, that's 20 miles an hour. The lights are flashing to remind you that it's 20 miles an hour. And I take personal offense at people that don't follow that speed limit, right? There's kids that are crossing that street, there's buses, cars that are pulling out. So what I do, especially during the school day, if I'm turning onto Lake Road, is I'll do the math, and the math that's in my head is, would there be enough room if that person were going the speed limit? And if the answer is yes, I'll pull out, and I will go exactly 20 miles an hour. And of course, they end up tailgating me, getting angry, and whatever. And then I do the slow turn when I turn onto Boss Lane, right? I put the blinker on plenty of time, and then I don't make any great effort to quickly get out of their way. So I'm just reminding them that it's 20 miles an hour and there are children here. I'm sure that's exactly what they understood from my actions.
And see, I grew up in San Antonio.
Yeah.
And learning how to drive, you had to keep in mind that no matter where you were in the city, the person next to you driving could be 102 years old.
Yeah.
And so you had to be very careful because they probably didn't know where they were going.
Yeah.
And they were driving 10 miles an hour.
Well, and I will admit that I've had to moderate my driving because the other math that's going on in my head is that somebody from the church, right? This is sounding way more thought out than it actually is. It's more of a knee-jerk reaction, which I have solely, by the way, inherited from my father. My dad is 100% to blame for this. He, from the beginning, taught me what he liked to refer to as aggressive defensive driving. Right? So if that doesn't clue you in as my dad's driving habits, I don't know what will. Also, I have to think, this is less joking, but like in the 21st century, I have to remember that people have guns, in their cars.
Yes.
Did you all see the story about the shooting in downtown? It's crazy. And then I saw that person lived on Council Crest, not so far from where I live. Yeah. What's that? The murderer. Yeah, the murderer had a $895,000 house because it was listed on his bankruptcy filing up on Council Crest Road, whatever that is. Yep. Shot a guy in the chest because the guy asked him to move his car because he was blocking traffic in front of a hotel. So I should probably be careful about who I politely inform of their mistaken driving. Yeah. Especially in the new car, right? Yeah.
Make sure it's not bad.
Yeah, exactly. Make sure it's not Matt first. Okay. Sorry. Now I feel better.
We don't want you to get shot and killed.
I don't either.
We have to do a 3-year search.
What's that?
We have to do a new search.
Oh yeah, right. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. It would take so long to find another pastor. I appreciate it. Oh, that's great. Touche. Yeah, right. Well, I was gonna segue straight into Nero, but I talking about other uplifting conversations. But I want to just kind of like compile some of the stuff that we talked about, especially if you haven't been here for all the weeks. The last few weeks, what we, so in the beginning we did a couple of weeks kind of like talking about the context, right? Excuse me. So Rome, 3rd century BCE and onwards, the effect of the Roman culture, political scene, philosophy, etc., on Israel, on the Jews, and then eventually how those influences affect the formation of Christianity, right? In fact, Jim validated me this week. Well, actually, you validated the author of the book in that he sent me there's like a flow chart of philosophical influences, and there was a box with Christianity, and one line pointed to Stoicism, the other line pointed to Platonism. So you have it confirmed by secondary sources.
I'm not really checking up on you.
In fact, Jim goes on and fact checks everything. let me do a quick one. So we were talking about the influences on Christianity, its formation, and then why Christianity becomes what it does as it forms and grows. the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about the early church and how it forms post-resurrection, what that looks like. Last week, we were talking about worship, right? We were talking about how that kind of takes off, how Christianity, or the Jewish cult of Christianity at that point in time begins to diverge from Judaism, right? So one of the things that the Christians did in beginning was they would celebrate the resurrection meal, which we now hold as the Eucharistic communion on the first day of the week in honor of the resurrection, right? Which is Sunday, which again affirms us for being right about the day of Sabbath. Okay. And what happened then over time is that the divergence became the Jewish Christian cult began shifting their fasting days from Monday, Thursday to Wednesday, Friday. Friday, in solidarity, in honor of the crucifixion, obviously would match that. Wednesday, I'm not sure the significance. However, it seems that the church has carried forth that emphasis on we do things in the church on Wednesdays far into the future, which that might be a false trail. But anyways. And that early Christian church we talked about was, in fact, made up, especially in the 3rd and 4th decades after after Jesus, increasingly of Gentile people. And the Gentile term is a big bucket that holds a lot of different identities in it. One of those identities is we talked about the Hellenists, right? Which is even still a pretty broad bucket. That's a big catch-all term to describe a lot of people. But in general, what that means is people who have a Greek, or I should say more of a Roman identity, a Greek identity, and yet are practicing Jews, right? They might have Greek names. One of the ones that we are familiar with because we talked about him would be Philip, right? Philip is a very Greek name, named after perhaps Philip, father of Alexander, right? Philip of Macedon, which, by the way, is the namesake for Philippi. Philippi is named after Philip, the father of Alexander the Great. So Philip, that's a Greek name. And so Philip perhaps is kind of an example of the Hellenizing influence. One of the remarkable things about Philip, too, is that as the Christian church begins to grow, especially through the book of Acts, Philip is the one who initially begins to reach beyond the boundaries of established Christianity. So Philip forms a church in Samaria, right? We hear about Philip doing that in the book of Acts. He's recruiting thousands and thousands of people, and that's when he gets whisked off by the Holy Spirit down to the Ethiopian eunuch, and then potentially sets up a church in Ethiopia in the process. So we have Philip, who may or may not be considered a Hellenist, beginning to expand the church beyond its borders. One of the other things that we talked about last week is how the Jewish Christian church, aka the church in Jerusalem, actually kind of withers and fades. They end up moving to a town called Pella in the wake of persecution by the Jewish authorities, right? So we have several people that are arrested and killed, including James, the brother of, or James the Greater first, and eventually James the brother of Jesus. And so that's seen as a good time to skedaddle. And again, one of the people that was doing a lot of that persecution was a guy named Saul, who eventually becomes Paul, who becomes one of the greatest Christianizers of the Hellenistic world. Right? Paul has many travels that he makes, which again are permitted because of the civilizing influence of the Roman Empire. Right? Paul is able to visit pretty much anywhere he wants because he's a citizen and he can do that, right? And the laws and the security of the land guarantee that kind of thing. So that kind of brings us up to where we're at now. Now, one of the other things that happens to the Jewish community, not the Jewish Christian community, but the Jewish community in general, is that they are removed from Rome in 52, something like that. Let me let me correct that. I don't know, now I can't find it. I think it was around 52, somewhere around there. Early 6th decade. And there is a lot of debate over why. We know that there was some kind of conflict occurring specifically in Rome. And keep in mind, we've talked about this too, is that there is some natural kind of built-in, not conflict per se, but an incompatibility between the Jewish identity, which includes the Christian identity at this point, and the Roman identity. They don't make great soldiers, not because they're weak or not masculine enough, but they insist on taking Fridays and Saturdays off, right? They have really strict dietary restrictions, right? Which is, from a modern perspective, great. I just love this. I've got this joke in my head of like, the Jewish conscript, raising his hand at mess hall saying, "I don't eat shellfish." They're the first gluten-free folks, yeah, right? And then on top of that is this issue of monotheism, right? Jews are monotheistic. I don't think I need to elaborate on that too much. Contrasted with the religious identity of Rome, which is built on this idea of inclusivity of other deities, right? We talked about that as well too. The pantheon, meaning all gods, pantheos, all gods being welcome within the Roman pantheon, and that was something that they used in their colonizing efforts. Was syncretism, as they would absorb the deities of conquered peoples as a way of absorbing those peoples, right? You don't have any religious uprisings if you're okay with their, if you're okay with their religion. Contrast that with the Jewish people who are monotheistic, and in being monotheistic are, by default, disproving the existence of other deities, or ignoring, or at least saying they're not as cool as our God, take that how you will. That can be a problem, and for a long time, it was and continued to be. The Romans, rightly so, are worried that these people who deny the existence of their gods are not going to fall in line, right? They aren't going to assimilate into the empire. But one of the things that comes out of all that, though, is a realization by the Roman leadership, and I'm really simplifying this, but a realization that even though the Jewish peoples are a little bit finicky, overall they're not about to rise up and try to overthrow the empire. In fact, the people that are in charge, especially in Jerusalem, up until around 70, mainly want to maintain the status quo, right? So the Sadducees, the Herodians, the people in the temple, because they've got their temple. That's great. They didn't have it for a long time. Things are going well in that regard. The people that are supposed to be in power are in power. And if we can just keep those pesky zealots from doing terroristic things, everything would be okay. And so, kind of the Roman position, and we actually see this in the Gospels, especially when Pontius Pilate's questioning Jesus, is that it's a Jewish problem. It's not our problem. You guys sort it out amongst yourselves. It's not ours to deal with. And last week we talked about this too, that in fact, in many cases, the Roman authorities intervene only to protect Roman interests, but by and large, let the Jews sort themselves out, right? That doesn't hold true with Christianity. Unfortunately, obviously, for various reasons, which we're gonna talk about today. This is a great segue coming here. So in 52, somebody feel free to Google or fact check that. Somewhere in the early 50s, Jews are expulsed from Rome, which includes Jewish Christians, right? Everybody gets kicked out, okay? One of the interesting consequences of that is when they begin to return, one of the things that they find is that their communities of faith are still there, but populated more so now by not necessarily Hellenist Christians, well, maybe more Hellenists, but even more, one of the categories we talked about last week, God-fearers, or people that were kind of on the fringes that were interested, curious in Judaism, but not necessarily willing to go under the knife as of yet. So the church, the identity of these churches has changed, which then prompts the writing of so many of Paul's epistles, right? So Paul's letter to Rome, Paul's letter to Galatia, and to some extent Paul's letter to Philippi. These are all letters that Paul is writing to communities, a lot of which are in conflict. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, same thing. And the major conflict that's going on during that time is Jew versus Gentile. I don't need to write that up there, right? In other words, Christianity is originally a Jewish cult, right? It's a group of Jewish people who have embraced the return of the Messiah and have begun to imagine the implications of what that means. But now, it's moving beyond that. It's not just a Jewish thing anymore. And there's a lot of people that have almost little to no, quote-unquote, Jewish identity, who are profoundly Gentile, profoundly Greek, Roman, whatever, or, modern, Turkish or wherever, right? That are participating in this thing called Christianity. But they don't want to become Jewish to participate in Christianity. That's not who they are. But they have found value, or they have, experienced the power of the resurrected Lord, and that's changed who they are, right? So Paul is writing about those conflicts. Now, going back to the eviction from Rome, there are theories, I can match my verb to my, there are theories that this Christian-Jewish conflict is one of the main reasons that this booting from Rome happens. It's all conjecture. We don't have a good idea. One of the things that we do know, right, is this is only 20 years before the Jewish-Roman War. So probably some other conflict going on there as well, right? This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. But this is kind of a foretaste of what is to come, okay? Real persecution, by and large, what we think about when we think about when we talk about the persecution of Christians, which is people thrown into gladiatorial arenas with lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and mass crucifixions and all of that. It happens much later than we tend to think about, right? One of the misconceptions that I operated on as a Christian was this idea that as soon as Jesus died, persecution nonstop, right? That's why the disciples were hiding in the locked room. It was nonstop. Nobody liked Christians, right? So it's a miracle that anybody survived out of that. Not quite true. Does not actually reflect reality. In fact, if you were to take the roughly 300 years from the death of Jesus to the council at Nicaea, is like 329, something like that, Paul, right? Those 300 years, and we're to parse out the times in which Christianity is undergoing quote unquote great persecution, they're few and far between, right? They're the minority, not the majority. However, persecution is a sliding scale, which you feel free to quote me on that. Meaning that persecution, being thrown into the gladiatorial arena with lions, tigers, and bears, doesn't always have to function in that extreme of a way. It could be as simple as my neighbors won't talk to me because they found out I'm Christian, right? So keep that in mind. The other thing is that where is this persecution happening? Primarily in Rome, okay? It's not that it isn't far-flung, but most of the extreme persecutions are happening near Rome. That's the center of most of this. Okay, so let's talk about fun stuff. Let's talk about Nero. Who knows anything about Nero? What do you know about Nero? Fiddled while Rome burned, right? That's one of the myths. What else do you know about Nero?
That he was a little off-center.
He was a little addled, potentially. Yeah. Killed his mom, right? That was a thing. Potentially his wife and his brother as well. Yeah, so killed his mom, Agrippina. I love Roman names, by the way. I don't know if y'all... So Nero, his original name is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Hanna-Barbera. I'm sorry. I'm doing free word association here. Nero is born in AD Common Era 37, so not long after this Jesus guy was on the scene. He was born to Gnaeus, Gnaeus, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, and Agrippina the younger. His dad dies early on, his mom remarries. She, in fact, is the great-great-granddaughter of Augustus, the OG emperor. So his dad dies when he's 2, his mom remarries, and she remarries Emperor Claudius. Wow, married up, right? Subtle upgrade. Nero has an interesting life. A lot of the stuff that we take for granted about Nero is, as all things are being questioned by scholarship. In other words, how much of these things are factual history and how much of them are just stories that people like to tell because Nero was a weird dude. And a lot of it now is falling into that latter category, right? So when Rome burned, was he playing the fiddle? Probably not. Or at least if he was playing the fiddle, he wasn't playing it celebrating the burning of Rome. He just so happened to be playing the fiddle when the fire started, something along those lines. What we do know is that Nero changes over the course of his reign as emperor. I began to talk about this a little bit last week, but when Nero officially comes on the scene, he actually is trying to be a populist emperor. He is trying to win the hearts and minds, so to speak. Specifically the hearts and minds of the dispossessed. So, what does that mean in a Roman context? Probably is maybe similar to what how we use that word in our modern experience, but maybe different as well too. So it's the poor, right? Those on the fringes. He's trying to be the people's person, right? And one of the aspects of that, which hence the fable about the fiddle, unintentional alliteration there, is that he considered himself an artiste. He was a great patron of the arts and put a lot of money and effort into being accepted by that community, who profoundly rejected him. And this is actually a theme that you see pop up with Nero over and over again, is that he tries to win over people and they just kind of don't like him, right? Who knows why? Maybe he was just a kid that wasn't cool and everybody, how there's that one kid that everybody can just tell right off the bat isn't cool, right? It's some kind of like groupthink thing, Maybe that was poor Nero. So Nero changes over time, maybe due to this kind of rejection by society, especially popular society, maybe due to mental illness, right? It's the 1st century Common Era. We didn't have a great grasp of what mental illness looked like or how to treat it, right? We mainly considered that there were demons inhabiting the person. And if you're emperor, you can't afford to be mentally ill, right? It's inconvenient for the state. So what happens over time is that Nero changes. He begins to be I want to be careful in characterizing this because again, this is all based off of accounts during the time and now research many years later. But to make a long story short, by the time we get to the Great Fire in Rome, that isn't the thing that culminates in him going off the rails a little bit. It's already begun to happen. Does that make sense? What do we know about the Great Fire in Rome?
How did it start?
That's a good question. Do we know when it happens? I think I did. I think I maybe mentioned this last week. 64. In fact, I have a date for it as well. June 18th. Anybody got a birthday June 18th? June 18th. 64, Common Era. How did it start? That's a really good question. Nobody knows. There are plenty of theories. One of the theories is that it started in an oil warehouse in one of the districts. Of course, oil warehouse, what could go wrong? Just, it's where we store all of our flammable stuff, which you have to have, right? Because that's how you light your house and your streets and all that jazz. But we don't know. We don't know how it started. And that kind of is the problem, is that even days after the fire. Nobody knows how it started, but there's a lot of theories. Yeah, Jim.
Is there one theory that he wrote it down so he could build his
Yep.
empire in that area?
Yeah, so this is, we're familiar with this. This is where we get into competing narratives. And Nero finds himself in the wake of this fire, which lasted something like 7 days or something like that. So 10 out of the 14 districts that made up Rome at that time burned essentially to the ground, right? Huge loss of life, huge, structural damage. It was awful, right? Like the Great Fire in London, there were no fire engines with, it's buckets and hands, right? So a week after the fire, people start to come up with theories as to how the fire started. Perhaps there was a campaign by the corporation that owned the oil warehouse to shunt attention away from the oil warehouse. Who knows? But one of the main theories that comes out of this, which is most scholars agree not perpetuated, it does not originate by Nero, is that the Christians did it. And one of the reasons that they come up with this is that out of these 4 areas that didn't burn, most of them had Christians and Jews living in them, right? Are there perhaps explainable reasons why perhaps they didn't burn that are perfectly factual? Perhaps, maybe it was just pure luck. But it begins to be the rumor that's told. Similarly to how in 2023 with the World Wide Web and supposedly fact-checking journalists, we've had a preponderance of now retracted stories in the wake of the Israel-Hamas conflict these past weeks. Does anybody, there's been a bunch of hubbub about whether or not babies' heads actually got cut off. Kind of like, is this the conversation we want to be having? I don't know. It seems like we could perhaps focus on other stuff. But guess what fake news happened in I use that phrase very hesitantly, happened in Rome too. So one of the prevailing narratives is actually that, yes, Nero did it himself. He conspired with the Jews to burn Rome to the ground. They missed an obvious narrative point there. So Nero, in his grandiosity and his seeking to, inflate his own ego and align with his artistic aspirations, burns Rome to the ground so that he can rebuild it the way that he wants it to be, right? Clean slate. This is where the story of him playing fiddle in the tower while he's watching Rome burn comes from. So obviously Nero's got a problem. This is one of the narratives. He hears this other narrative that Christians, perhaps, are responsible because their homes didn't burn. And guess what Nero does? He does the simple math that every politician in a scandal does. He says, I want people to pay attention to that story, not this story. This is what I love about this, is nothing has changed. And in 2,000 years, nothing has changed in how we handle this stuff, right? You can't disprove your story, simply put another story out there for somebody to hang on to, and that's what happens. And so he doesn't start it, but he begins to support it and then takes it to its inevitable consequences, which is Nero then begins what we refer to as the Neron persecutions of Christians, which get absolutely crazy, right? Like this is the one point that everybody agrees on is, yeah, it got nuts, right? So burning people alive in order to light his parties probably happened. And have human beings done worse things to each other over the course of history? Absolutely. And yet this is awful, right? So what does that look like? Right? This is the important question. What does that look like? What that looks like is from 64 onwards, Rome is not a great place to be if you're a Christian or a Jew. Just plain and simple. You don't want to be there. You get arrested. Neighbors accusing neighbors. It gets as nasty as we think about, think the Salem witch trials, that kind of stuff. Beyond Rome, well, not so much, believe it or not. Do these persecutions extend beyond the territorial walls of Rome? Yeah, absolutely, right? But it's kind of one of those things where the farther you get away from the capital, the less it matters, right? It's like, who cares about what's going on in Portland if you're living in Burns, right? That kind of stuff, which also is fueling a lot of conflict in our modern era as well, too. So, if you're thinking about, how does this affect, Christians living in the Church of Asia Minor, maybe they're hearing about it, maybe they're experiencing some of it, but by and large, it's stories about what's going on there. And this is important to think about because when we think about John of Patmos, who, yes, was an absolutely different person than John who wrote the Gospel of John, verifiable, Gustavo points to it. When John of Patmos writes his letter, right, aping and subverting imperial imagery and talking about, using his metaphorical language, the downfall of the whore of Babylon, a lot of it is actually subverting and mocking Rome and its imperial power. Right? That's a different story for a different day. Do persecutions end with Nero? Unfortunately, no. Nero is kind of the first. He at least gets credit for something. But Nero doesn't last much longer, so the fire happens in 64. He dies in 68 under suspicious circumstances. How was Nero killed? Anybody know that? It's suicide. That's what it was. He committed suicide in 68 after having killed his wife and his brother, his Britannia. I will always not to be confused with the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Did he actually do the killing, or did he have
had them killed? Yeah, he didn't. I mean, he's an emperor. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. But persecutions don't end with Nero. So after Nero, we have a brief. What's the word I'm looking for? A brief Pax Romana, a brief. Oh, good Lord! Don't you hate that when you're trying to find a word and it doesn't?
He's thinking of respite between.
Respite. Thank you. A brief respite of about 68 to 13 years or so, roughly. There's a couple of emperors that happen in there until we get to Domitian. Have you heard of Domitian? So we've had Nero, and now we've got Domitian. Okay, but let's take a pause before we get into Domitian, because I've been talking. What? When you were growing up in the church, what was your perspective on persecution of Christianity? How were you taught about it? Or were you? That's maybe a better question. No?
Well, they had these movies out.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I encountered it.
Yeah, they had this one I remember. It was so gross that my dad took it. I was probably 12 or something. Took it to the movie theater in the back where you could get into the theater for a quarter. And he took us kids down there, and shoot, about halfway through the movie, he just took us out and said, "No, I'm not going to watch this anymore." It was terrible. I kept ruminating the movie.
What do you think our fascination is with that?
I would watch it today. If I knew what I was going to see.
Yeah.
People tied up, lions being released on them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Jesus is for the underdog. Do we not want to be the underdog so that we can be the person that Jesus is for?
That's part of it, isn't it? Our identity as the underdog, the persecuted, the bullied.
I've never seen the movie Ben-Hur.
Yeah.
But some of those Charlton Heston movies
Yeah.
are about the Christians.
That's the first thing that comes to mind, but I am having a hard time remembering the plot of Ben-Hur. all I can. What was it? Was it? Okay. All I can picture is Charlton Heston with his shirt off. I mean, not that. I mean, as a hetero man, not that it was just in those days they would oil them down too, so it was a remarkable sight. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, Charlton Heston, what an interesting character. So what I'm hearing a little bit from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were aware of it, but it didn't really factor into your understanding of Christianity, which is interesting. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, to be fair, a lot of us grew up post-World War II.
Yeah.
Which means that we're triumphalists through and through. We don't know of being the minority. We don't know of being the persecuted. We don't know how to relate to that. So it's just kind of a warning that, oh gosh, things may be nice now, but they could be bad again.
Yeah.
Was the way I understood it. And that this is so consequential, this faith that we hold, that people kill us for it.
Yeah.
It must be true.
Yeah. Jackie.
The way I was raised, very much those things, was that these people really, really suffered, and we had it so good.
Ah.
And we were very fortunate to be living at a time where we didn't have to deal with that kind of discrimination.
Yeah.
Right, but again, we're the privileged without having any sense that we're the privileged.
Yeah.
It's simply assumed that that this is our natural state, that is the unnatural state, and that there is a devil because the devil has fire and a pitchfork and narrowness.
Post-World War II, certainly was privileged, but growing up, I certainly was aware of what my father had gone through in the Army, what other people had gone through, and how horrific that was, and how blessed we were, I was, to be a product of the Greatest Generation.
Yeah.
And so you felt, you kind of knew what had happened to get you there.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happened with us as Christians.
That's a yeah, and I hear Jackie saying the same thing. That's a very insightful remark. Part of the reason I bring this up is and I guess I'm a bit younger than many of you all. I had a very different experience. Popular culture, especially in the 90s, which were kind of my formative years. A lot of what I heard coming out of, and again, Christianity, was an attempt to point out how we're actually persecuted. And even though we're not being rounded up and thrown into gladiatorial arenas, a lot of what I heard coming out of Christianity, and mainly out of the talking heads that show up on news and televangelist stuff, is that Christianity is being persecuted, but from a religious standpoint, not necessarily from a physical standpoint.
I've heard a friend of mine, I don't know how old he is, he might be your age perhaps, I don't know him that way, who is Assemblies of God, he's currently a nun, was trying to make this point. He's like, don't you understand how persecuted that? And I was like, no. I was like, what you're speaking of.
Yeah.
So it is, I think maybe, yeah.
And it's funny, I'm trying to think of a specific thing, like was there a movie or something that pointed me in this direction, and I'm having a hard time coming with it. I just have this sense that the prevailing voice, and especially when I was a teenager going into young adulthood, was that with the declining religiosity of America, one of the motivating forces behind it was the desire to stamp out Christianity, right? And here's the thing, as I say this, not because I want to legitimize that voice, but my reaction to it, especially once I went into religious training, was it was an intentionally cultivated sense of wanting to co-opt this persecuted identity in order to perhaps pull a Nero. I don't know. Even up so far as, again, this is before, like, for example, what what's the movie about the Catholic Church in Boston? It's so great. It's not Snapshot. It's something like that.
Yeah.
But like before the church sex abuse scandal, before public opinion tipped in the opposite direction, I heard a lot of that about, well, they're just trying to bring down the Catholic Church because they were what they. Oh yeah. Oh good Lord, the red Starbucks cups. Yeah. I mean that's more recent. I didn't mean to derail us. But here's something. Again, maybe this is a me thing. Maybe my experience was different than all yours. I came in prepared today to debunk the myths of Christian persecution, and it seems like I don't have to that much. But so, spoiler alert, I don't think that Christians are being necessarily persecuted. Again, put an asterisk there, because when we talk about religious and tribal warfare in other parts of the world, a lot of it continues to be based off of religion, which are we that much different? Not really. So I don't want to claim in totality that kind of stuff isn't happening, because we hear stories about what it's like to be a Christian in China, with the post People's Revolution, and how the suppression of anything not in line with Confucianism, etc. is not allowed. So again.
In our country, I have read that part of the proliferation of Protestant denominations is because we had in our Constitution no state religion.
Yeah.
But early on, Methodists would be run out of town.
Yeah.
And there was persecution of anyone who wasn't from the Church of England. That would be it.
I mean, basically, the 13th century through the 16th century in the British Isles is a narrative of the winning side tossing out the other side, and again, and I bring here's the other side of this, is that one of the narratives that we tell about our country is how the people that founded our country were fleeing religious persecution, right? It's a little more, what does that mean, and what did that look like, and is that necessarily true? Well, not quite. That's another thing. Susan.
Yeah, it seems like we really haven't had a lot of Christian persecution in our country.
Yeah.
However, when we look at, it's not religious, what maybe it is partly, but the indigenous people and African American people who have a history of persecution in our own time.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's very real for marginalized people to feel that they're
100%. Right. 100%. Yeah. I mean, if you look at like the history of conflict in like Sudan and Rwanda and places like that, one of the things that we often do is we chalk it up to religious conflict, when a lot of times the religious aspect of it is consequential, and it does have an impact, but it's cultural identities that go way back that happen to align with religious identity.
Anti-Semitism.
Yep.
Like I'm saying, anti-Asian.
Yeah.
It's not religious, but it's cultural.
Absolutely. And I guess that's the reason that I bring this up as well, is that I don't have enough time to get into talking about Palestine right now. But again, my experience of hearing voices wanting to claim persecution has made me gun shy. I want to be very careful about when people try to use that persecuted identity as justification, right? Because I hear a lot of that, I heard a lot of that, and I continue to hear a lot of that coming out of some of the more radical conservative aspects of Christianity, is that we need to fight, right? And they mean that folks mean that quite literally sometimes, to protect the Christian identity, and you'll hear that language now, the Christian nation, right? This is Christian nationalism rises out of this. And, this is a scenario where, understanding the nature of Christianity's persecution as history, for me, goes a long way in kind of defanging that, right? Because I mean, it's really ego killing. But a lot of the persecution that Christianity experienced was like secondhand smoke. like there was no great scheme by the Roman leadership over the course of 300 years to stamp out Christianity. In fact, they really just wanted to ignore it up until the end of the 3rd century. We'll talk about that next week.
It was quite ignorable.
It was quite.
I mean, 30 years after the death of Jesus, right? A mere 30 years.
Yeah.
You've got a group in the capital of the empire
that's
a threat.
Yeah.
Pretty profound.
Yeah. We're the Roman Empire after all. I think.
But I think
We
that's
face
part
down elephants.
That's what I think of as the psychology of the group teaching its history to its young, or to itself. It's saying we stand for such pure truth that those who are bothered by it are after us.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, are we really that much of it? That's pretty egotistical, pretty narcissistic of the group to consider ourselves so important that they want to get us. You know, we're just not that important.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah. Most of the time.
Until we are too important. And then, somebody wants to gun for you. I mean, I was born on a reservation in this country, and I'd come out of a Lutheran, boarding school or whatever. I'd be against the Lutherans too.
Yeah, totally.
Pretty simple deal.
Totally. Yeah.
Take away everything
we probably deserve it that way too.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess this is for me the interesting part about this is that if you look, so Nero blames the Christians. He wasn't the first to do it, but he picks up this narrative of blaming the Christians for the fire because it's politically convenient at the time. Ignoring the fact, well, not ignoring, but not to mention the fact that the beginning of the end had already happened for Nero, right? He was already on the downhill slide. It was a really kind of a desperate effort, and then this poor minority Jewish cult that had just popped up in Rome is a convenient scapegoat. Do we see that elsewhere in history? All the time, right? The minorities are, I mean, a lot of, not to take us too far off the road here, but I mean, we talk about the horrific things that were done in the early 20th century to the family, to the descendants of freed slaves in our country, from Emmett Till on upwards, right? Something happens in a community that's primarily white, and blame the people that obviously stand out, right? Or the people that don't have any power because they want, because racism. Christians just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? And in fact, that continues to be a trend in the persecution of Christians throughout history. So Nero meets his untimely end. Titus takes over, or I think there's a guy in between him and Titus. Can't remember. Eventually, Titus takes over. Things are relatively stable for a number of years, and then eventually Domitian takes over. And Domitian, similar to Nero, originally isn't that upset about the Christians, but Domitian is seeking to consolidate power, and one of the things that he blames for what he sees as the thinning of Roman blood, right, or for the weakness of the empire, is their tolerance for these aberrant religions that have cropped up in Rome, and Christianity being an obvious example for it. And under Domitian is where we get these fantastic, crazy stories that come out of Christianity. Like, Christians eat babies, and they bake babies into loaves of bread, and then they share it on their horrific meals that where they all get naked and do crazy things. I mean, you can imagine. It literally is imagination, right? All the crazy stuff. But even in this, it's not about Christianity. It's another convenient political tool for this guy to consolidate power. And this is a theme that pops up over and over and over again, all the way up until what we'll talk about next week, which is we're fast forwarding in time quite a bit. We're going to fast forward to finished out the persecution narrative, then we're going to come back and look at the formation a little bit more. But if you fast forward to the craziness that happens towards the end of the 3rd century, where it really gets bad, it's that exact same narrative again. Is that we have tolerated the presence of this aberrant religion within our midst for too long. It is actively causing the weakening of Roman men. That is actually a phrase that comes out. We have become effeminate. We are no longer the mighty. It has altered our, well, they wouldn't say DNA, but it's altered our very being.
Testosterone levels are down.
Our testosterone levels are down, right? And this is the reason that we're experiencing all the troubles that we are. And we essentially get a string of, well, because it begins under the Tetrarchy, right? When we had that brief period where they had 4 emperors. What a unique idea. That worked out really well. But then a string of emperors. Galerius is in there, and then another guy. Where this is it. This is the reason that Christianity is so bad. And one of the remarkable pieces about this is how this drastically impacts the formation of the church in the 4th century, which is that one of the edicts that's issued in a way to combat the weakening of this, which is to force Christianity out of people, is that they basically pass an edict saying anyone who is Christian, either self-identified or identified by a neighbor, needs to make sacrifice and then sign a letter forsaking of Christianity. Which, I mean, if you think about anything that is more oppositely aligned to the nature of Christianity, right, is right there. And guess what? Some people actually do it, right? Because if the choice, I mean, keep in mind that Christianity has become somewhat normalized by the end of the 3rd century. So if given the choice between being thrown, and again, we're back to the gladiator pits again, in the gladiatorial arena with wild animals that are going to tear me apart, or signing a piece of paper, I'm just going to sign the piece of paper, right? That seems like a no-brainer. Well, guess what? When the church finally begins to form in the wake of Constantine, and all that stuff, which we'll also cover, the Christians that didn't sign the paper take issue with it. And in fact, one of the first conflicts that confronts this new church is, what do we do with the lapsed Christians? So, do we permit them a way back into good standing in the church, which they did provide an avenue? But that was only available to certain people. And it was only available to people who had, quote unquote, a good reason, right, for signing it, right? And how they determined that, we'll talk about. But the folks that were just worried about their own life, well, gosh, are you a good Christian or not? Right? Aren't you supposed to forsake your own life that you might gain it? Isn't that how this is supposed to work? And so they actually, essentially, excommunicate masses of people and say, you are outside God's grace. If you spend the rest of your life praying for forgiveness, maybe God will have mercy on you, the church won't. And that's the church. That's the new church of the 4th century. And that's the church that we all get to trace our heritage back to. So, woo!
There are some theologies or perhaps priests talking and whatnot back in this general area that professed a very strong martyrs theology.
Yes.
Come join the get killed party,
Yeah.
Well, the blood of the martyrs.
Blood of the martyrs is the seed. Yeah.
And it is worth questioning whether or not an unpersecuted group can survive.
Yeah.
And is that going to show up in this history of
Yes.
surrounded these guys or something?
This is next week. Because what happens is you essentially get a cult of the martyrs that comes out of this. In fact, this is what becomes one of the new identities within Christianity, especially post-Domitian, is that the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs, literally is the seed that sows the church. And in fact, what we see, and this is so stereotypical, right? Is Paul made an offhand comment, right? It's like any group that wants to succeed needs to be persecuted at some point. Is what we actually see is the stories of the martyrs become the gospel in a lot of ways. The stories of the martyrs, you know, bravely, you know, saying their final words before they're burned at a stake or nailed to a cross or thrown into a pit. It's almost like they're circulated around like penny dreadfuls. I mean, like literally, these stories are circulated all over, and this is what strangely draws people and again, this is philosophy, this is psychology, is what makes people begin to respect Christianity, right? Like these are strong people, strong in their convictions. They believe so much in what they think, right? What their philosophy is, what their theology is, that wow, if they're that committed to it, I wonder if there's something to that, right?
Join Hamas today.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that next week. We'll briefly cover Domitian, but that's going to be primarily what we're going to talk about. The martyrs and persecution, a more cheerful concept.
Let's see, Brendan, did Mike say we were to take this down?
No, he doesn't.
Well, every once in a while, I get this whole phlegm that just settles and doesn't want to go away. But it's certainly a lot better than last.
I mean, we
Show you later.
make a lot of qualified by martyrdom.
So tell me what you did yesterday.
More so, it's this idea of by martyrdom.
She just really.
And that's how I think how these groups thrive.
I don't know how many minutes
Not so much about Islam or the church, but it's that built community. In the same way, right? Like, minority communities in schools, right? All the nerds have whatever, right? All the bullies form their own community. Well, they can see themselves as bullies, so they can take on their team. That's
Yeah.